Hey monster fans, in this video we'll be looking at a few horror films from the 1920s that were shaped by the decade in which they were made. For many countries, the 1920s brought economic prosperity. The world had just come off of the real-world terrors of World War I and the Spanish flu, and we were ready to start living life again with all its enjoyments, including a new boom in cinema. In 1920, the Cabinet of Dr Caligari was released, premiering in Berlin on the 26th of February that year. The film was directed by Robert Wine and was made by an independent company in Germany. The film focuses on a mad hypnotist who uses a somnambulist to commit murders for him. The film uses a dark and twisted visual style with structures that lean and have pointed forms. For this, it's considered a quintessential work of German expressionist cinema. One of the film's writers served as an officer during the war and was left with a resentment of the military, which is seen in the script. Also, co-writer Karl Mayer, who would plead madness in order to avoid military service, which led him to intense examinations from a military psychiatrist, would also kind of put in his input. These experiences drove the men to write a unique story that contains an anti-authority message within it. Many saw the expressionistic style of the world in this film as representing post-war Germany, a Germany that seemed to be removed from all reality after its immense losses. A Germany whose loss of reality may have led to the rise of Hitler, in which this film foreshadows with the authoritative character of Dr. Caligari himself. The fantastic Conrad Veidt played the role of Cesare, the somnambulist, who is under control by Dr. Caligari, played by Werner Krauss. This control over a person was also taken from the war experience of Janowitz, as Caesar represents soldiers in the war who were mindlessly killing for looming authority figures. The 1920s also gave the world not only one but three film adaptations of Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde. First, in March of 1920, Paramount released Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde, which starred John Barrymore as the titular character. The film also starred Martha Mansfield as Jekyll's fiancée. The film was based off of the 1887 stage play by Thomas Russell Sullivan and was directed by John S. Robertson. In April of 1920, the second American-produced Jekyll and Hyde film was released. The film was directed and written by J. Charles Hayden and starred Sheldon Lewis. This film was more directly adapted from Stevenson's novel than the stage play, and unfortunately it was overshadowed by the Paramount version, which was probably given due to the short time between releases. In August of 1920, German film The Head of Janus was released. It was an unauthorized adaptation of Stevenson's novel that changed some of the names of the characters, causing the film to go unrecognized by some German media. The film was directed by F.W. Murnau, and it starred Conrad Veidt of Caligari fame as Dr. Warden/Mr. Connor. The film is also now a lost film, and only the film script and some production notes still survive. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde films for the 1920s represented a man's descent into utter violence, beast-like violence. It's no surprise that Germany and America would be interested in the story following World War I, where the two countries themselves became that bestial. Dracula's Death was released in August of 1921. It was a Hungarian-Austrian production that was directed and co-written by Carolee Lelait. The film is currently considered to be lost, but the plot centered around a woman who is experiencing frightening visions after being admitted into an insane asylum where one of the inmates claimed to be Count Dracula. Not known to many nowadays, but this film did precurse the hit vampire film coming the following year. Nosferatu is another major milestone film of the 1920s and can be easily seen as a start to the vampire popularity in film. The film was released in March of 1922. It was directed by F.W. Murnau and starred Max Schreck as Count Orlok. It was an unauthorized adaptation of the Dracula novel released in 1897. Bram Stoker's estate had refused permission to the novel's rights. Some changes were made to the film to get around the rights issues. However, it did not work, and Stoker's heirs sued, and a court ruling ordered that all copies of the film were to be destroyed. However, the film still survives today. Changes that were made to the Dracula novel for Nosferatu included a focus on rats instead of bats, which connects the themes to the European plague and rabies. Also, Van Helsing is not included in this telling of the story, which removes any authority figures or oppositions to the vampire. Count Orlok as a character could be a chaotic entity that represents the political and economical instability of Germany in the early 1920s. The film is still to this day a horror must and uses amazing atmosphere and great technical shots to invoke an eerie feeling still felt nearly 100 years later. It is also worthy to note that over in America in 1922, The Headless Horseman was adapted to film from Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. The film was directed by Edward D. Venturi and starred Will Rogers as Ichabod Crane. There were 3 silent film adaptations of the story, but this is the only one, however, to survive out of the 3. As we enter into 1923, The Hunchback of Notre Dame pushes us into what's considered the earliest Universal monster film. The film was directed by Wallace Wosley and produced by Carl Laemmle and Irving Thalberg. It was based on Victor Hugo's novel from 1831 and starred Patsy Ruth Miller as Esmeralda and the Mound of 1,000 Faces himself, Lon Chaney, as Quasimodo. This film elevated an already well-known Chaney into full Hollywood star. The film had amazing sets that recreated the Notre Dame Cathedral, and Lon Chaney brought immense physicality and emotion to the role of Quasimodo under pounds of makeup. This is a skill that he would later bring to his next big hit. 2 years later, Universal would work on their next adaptation, yet again calling upon Chaney to star. The Phantom of the Opera, based on Gaston Leroux's 1910 novel, was released in November of 1925. Chaney in the film went through another gruesome transformation to portray the Phantom. The film was shot on a soundstage commissioned by Carl Laemmle for the specific purpose of recreating the Paris Opera House for the film. It was located on the Universal Studios lot, Soundstage 28, being one of the oldest standing movie sets until it was demolished in 2014. There are so many versions of the film, and this is mostly due to the fact that the film is public domain, and Universal did not renew the rights for the film in 1953. In both The Hunchback and The Phantom, Chaney played 2 characters shunned by society because of the way they looked. These makeups for these 2 films resembled many of the faces of men who returned home to Europe and America post-World War I. These men were mangled by the horrible violence on the battlefield. Some of these guys also faced judgment and were shunned by society, much like the characters Chaney brought to life in these 2 films, in many ways making the so-called normal people more monstrous. Chaney brought a sympathetic aspect to the characters that would also be implemented with Karloff's monster in Frankenstein. Speaking of Frankenstein, in 1926, the film The Magician was released in October of that year by MGM. It was directed by Rex Ingram and stars Alice Terry and Paul Wegener. The story is about a magician's efforts to acquire the blood of a young virgin for his experiment to create life. It is a film that most haven't heard of, and it was considered lost for the longest time, but was shown at a couple of festivals around 1993, and later in 2011, Warner Brothers released the film on DVD. One of the most notable 1920s horror films is The Cat and the Canary, which was released in September of 1927. The film was an adaptation of John Willard's 1922 black comedy play of the same name. The film was directed by German expressionist film Paul Lenny. The film stars Laura LaPlante and Forrest Stanley. The story follows relatives of an eccentric millionaire who gather in his creepy mansion on the 20th anniversary of his death for the reading of his will. As the family prepares for dinner, a guard of the house announces to them that an escaped lunatic called the Cat is on the property. Paul Lenny was played into his expressionist background, which is what Universal was expecting him to bring to an American audience. He used similar camera effects that would have been used in the film like Cabinet of Dr Caligari, and using a lot of dramatic shadows as well. Just based on its technical aspects alone, the film is really noteworthy within its genre and all other films. In December of 1927, MGM would release London After Midnight. The film was a silent mystery film with horror overtones. The film was produced and directed by Dracula director Todd Browning and starred Lon Chaney. The plot centers on a wealthy man who supposedly committed suicide, and 5 years later his abandoned home is taken over by possible vampires. This film is one of the most sought after lost films of the 1920s. However, it's said that the last copy of the film was destroyed in an MGM fault fire in 1965. Closing out the 1920s is 1928's The Man Who Laughs, which was directed by Paul Lanley, coming off of The Cat and the Canary. The film was adapted from the 1869 novel of the same name and starred Conrad Veidt as the title character. The plot centers on a man who has a permanent smile carved into his face, which was done to him as a child after his father disrespected the king. The man is adopted by traveling showmen and becomes popular. One day he falls in love with a blind woman, played by Mary Philbin. However, after the king's death, an evil jester seeks to destroy him. One of the greatest influences the film had on modern pop culture was being the inspiration for the Joker in the Batman comics. The makeup was done by legendary makeup artist Jack Pierce, who would later go on to create the look for such monsters like the Frankenstein monster, the Mummy, and the Wolfman, just to name a few. The 1920s represented a big change for many countries. As a species, we faced the positives and negatives of post-World War I life. The war made us think differently of ourselves, others in our communities, and even made us question the society we lived in. Horror movies of this time represented these anxieties, and this began a newfound thirst for more of what this genre had to offer. It offered an escape that many entering the 1930s were going to need. Thanks for tuning in to another video. If you'd like to see more videos like this, be sure to subscribe and hit that like button, and I'll catch you in the next one.